And I mentioned this treaty process being foisted on Victorians by a hard-left Labor state government earlier in the week. Well, we now have a lot more detail, and it's a whole lot worse than any of us realised, me included. Not surprisingly, Premier Jacinta Allan is desperately trying to hose the whole notion of treaty down and frantically trying to separate the failed federal voice referendum and the no victory from what's being considered in her state. Here she was earlier this week babbling on about constitutions.
The key difference to the referendum that was put nationwide a couple of years ago is that was changing the constitution. This is not changing the Victorian Constitution. It's simply taking a common sense approach, sitting the First Peoples Assembly, an ongoing representative body, into our existing parliamentary structures. But the significant change is it'll be a body where we will be listening, taking on their advice.
Taking it into our significant parliamentary structures, they're the words you've got to worry about there. Note she said she was not about changing the Australian Constitution in that grab. Well, no one is suggesting she was. Indeed, what she's doing, along with her cabinet and a group of Indigenous activists, is a whole lot worse than that. Put simply, a standing royal commission paid for by Victorian taxpayers to the tune of $65 million so far has sat for 4 years. This thing's called the Yoorrook Justice Commission, and it's handed down to Parliament its final report. It's got 100 recommendations, and they expect to be ticked off by the Parliament. This truth-telling exercise wants Indigenous Victorians offered special tax relief. It wants cash compensation. It wants land given to Indigenous Victorians to compensate for colonisation. It wants Indigenous families given the right to keep their children out of school, and those same children be made exempt from expulsion and suspension from the school. Now, clearly, we're dealing here with a wide ambit claim, but as every Victorian would know, the most hard-left government in Australia, the Andrews-Allan government, probably agrees with most of this stuff. It was Dan Andrews who set up this whole process in a motion back in 2018. Now, but as it should be, it's the notion of a community divisive treaty involving land, water and lots of cash as compensation that should have not just Victorians worried but every Australian, because once it starts here, it will be open slather everywhere. Among other things this commission wants are churches to return what they claim, this Truth Commission, what they claim are stolen lands. They want markers erected on what they say are 50 massacre sites across the state. It goes on and on. Here's Premier Allan again today talking about how welcome the report was and, if you can believe it, promising to carefully consider all of the recommendations.
We're going to take our time to consider and respond to the report. When you listen to people, when you involve people directly impacted on decisions, you get better outcomes.
Now, bear in mind, there's no state election in Victoria until November next year. Labor has a comfortable majority in the Parliament and enjoys the support of the Greens and various left-leaning so-called independents. So they've got the numbers to ram this stuff through. Allan would claim she has a mandate to actually create a permanent Indigenous voice attached to state Parliament, which would, by law, need to be negotiated with on all legislation, whether it applies to Indigenous people or not. That's the facts of it. In recent times, Victorian Labor changed the rules around public drunkenness, turning it from a crime to preventing police from actually arresting people drunk in public. Instead, establishing at great cost sobering up facilities known as drunk tanks, one in Melbourne, several in regional centres. Why do I mention this? And reportedly these things are so little used it's not funny. So why do they exist? Well, in part because some Indigenous leaders were worried about Indigenous drunks being locked up, fearing deaths in custody. Now, that, my friends, is a practical example of where all of this is going to go. It's a race-dividing road we should not be going down, but sadly, we are already well down that road.